All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michal Kvetikev. I'm professor in the chair of Slavic department, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Greta Uehling, who is the lecturer in the program in International and Comparative Studies, and of course, the faculty associate of the Center for Latin and European Integration Studies, where we are now at the moment. And her scholarship broadly deals with the issues of international migration and forced displacement. And the project examined experiences of refugees, asylum seekers, and internationally displaced people. And of course, now, as we all facing this terrible crisis in Ukraine, which has this very important refugee aspect, she will be talking about her most recent book, Everyday War, the conflict over Donbass, Ukraine, which explored the subjective experience of military conflict and forced displacement in Ukraine. It is based on ethnographic fieldwork. It documents the war, how it reconfigured social worlds, and how the social world became the site of a different everyday kind of war. And I also want to mention a previous book, Beyond Memory, the Crimean Tatars Deportation and Return, 2004, which will be a new edition will be forthcoming this year, and because now I think that book also becomes more timely. So please, let's welcome Greta.
Hey, how's my volume? Sounds good? Sounds good. Okay, well, I'm really looking forward to sharing my research with you today. In the literature on war and conflict, interpersonal relationships are usually treated as tangents or backdrops to the real action. And this book and my talk today explores this idea that personal relationships are actually central to the way that both war and peace unfolds. So the book, Everyday War, the conflict over Donbass, Ukraine, basically takes readers on a journey through war-torn Ukraine to hear from some of the people who have been affected by that war. And being an ethnography, being anthropology, their voices are expressed in the text. I think that Alexandra exemplifies what I mean by everyday war. She fled her town of Luhansk when it was bombed with her family, and they settled a few 100 kilometers away. But then her father went back to fight as a member of a volunteer battalion. And the challenge was that he had to supply his own equipment for his position as a sniper. And so instead of going to university, instead of, paying attention to her friends, what Alexandra did was she went around to generate donations so that she could purchase him the equipment that he needed to be effective as a sniper. It started with footwear in his size. Then she got him camouflage and night vision goggles. And the week that we were speaking to each other, she planned to get him some tactical gloves so that the gun would not slip in his hand when he shot at people. And the reason that she exemplifies everyday war is that her daily life was consumed with provisioning her father, who fought in a battalion like this one. Now, she was fully conscious that the people that he would be killing were her former neighbors and perhaps even some of her friends in Luhansk. Was fully conscious of that, but his survival was paramount to her. And so I think what her story teaches us is that, we're people have heard about these volunteer battalions. They were very successful in slowing down the advance of Russian forces, but there's something else about this as well, which is that it was an interpersonal connection that led her to normalize the killing that he was doing as a sniper. Okay, so the war in Ukraine has really brought about a level of destruction not seen in Europe since World War II. And I think that, it's been spoken of as a hybrid war because of the sheer number of modalities that are used to accomplish it, right? It's not just the engagement of established state military forces, but it's also these volunteer battalions, forced population transfers, misinformation, disinformation, and the targeting of residential areas, right? So I think that my friend Kirillo said it best when he said, we witnessed the Aleppoization of Ukraine. And the picture on the right, the picture on the left of the slide is Aleppo, right? Aleppo was, of course, the site of during the war in Syria, of a major military confrontation that absolutely decimated residential areas. And I put these two photographs side by side because I'm struck by the extent to which they resemble each other. Right? This is a violation of international humanitarian law in which residential areas are not just collateral damage, but they're actually among the targets of the military activity. And I think that the pervasiveness of this type of warfare in the world today suggests that, the everyday war that I describe in the book, Everyday War, isn't isolated to Ukraine, right? It has applications in other settings as well. So in Ukraine, 14 million have been displaced. Some of them have gone back. Come on in. Over 8,000 civilians have been killed, 14,000 injured. Neither the Russian nor the Ukrainian military has been forthcoming with military casualties, but the United States government has estimated that it's about 100,000 on both sides. So I could go on describing the death, the destruction, but the purpose of my talk is actually very different. I became motivated to write this book when, during my research in Ukraine, I began to understand how deeply and consciously and strategically non-combatant civilians were engaging with the war going on around them. And so as a result of my research, I became much more interested in not so much in what was being done to people. Of course, that's very important, but what people were doing of their own accord, right? The ways in which they acted on their own behalf and on behalf of others. So what I'll do is first, I will talk a little bit about my research. Then I will talk a little bit more about the manifestations of everyday war. That will lead to a theoretical point about what this, the theoretical advantages of thinking in these terms affords, which has to do with rethinking feminist theories of militarization. That will take us to ethics of care. And then I want to close out by talking a little bit about the challenges and the issues associated with working in a difficult research context like Ukraine. Okay, so my ethnographic research was comprised of participant observation, right? Basically spending extended amounts of fairly unstructured time with people, whether that was having a meal, going on a day trip, getting pizza, going to a church service, sitting around on the couch in the Veterans Center or a shelter. And that gave me a much more intimate sense of what lives in displacement were like, because the bulk of the research has to do with the people who were forcibly displaced, but not exclusively. I also did interviewing. I interviewed 150 people over a 3-year period between 2015 and 2017. 65 of those interviews were devoted to what was then deemed a conflict and is now being called a war, right, between Russia and Ukraine. I did 2 types of interviewing. One of them is semi-structured. That just means that, you have a list of questions that was held relatively stable over the 3-year period, so that I could begin to assess how things were shifting over that time period, if at all. And then there were also open-ended interviews that I did with the people that were trying to assist the internally displaced. So social workers, psychologists, workers in shelters, government workers that were supervising programs for the internally displaced. So 45 semi-structured and 20 of the open-ended. The interesting thing about the open-ended, right, is just to afford you more flexibility to respond to the person. Some of them were also displaced. This is a shelter for the internally displaced. A lot of my work took place in settings like this. So the setting on the left it was a hotel that was underutilized and was repurposed for housing the internally displaced. The image on the right is a group of women who were housed in what had been a dormitory for a university. So this would be 2 typical settings for my research. So since the war dispersed people across Ukraine, I traveled to 4 cities and a number of smaller towns and villages to speak with really as wide a spectrum of people as I could, revisiting each of these places each of the 3 years of my research. And so the little black stars are the places where I primarily worked. Many of these are now either occupied or partially occupied by Russian forces. And I typically, I travel by rail between these locations, always actually. So the recorded interviews were transcribed, and then I coded them and analyzed them thematically using software for qualitative data analysis. And the coding was very thematic, right? It enabled me to determine what are the themes that are the most dense and how are they related to each other, right? This thematic coding that I did, which resulted in the book. And then since 2017, telephonic WhatsApp communication with a subset of the people that I worked with. Okay, so everyday war refers to these conscious and strategic practices that non-combatants engage in to participate in the war and respond to it. There's really many examples. In the slide, we have holding bake sales and raising funds for then volunteer battalions. A lot of the work that was done early on had to do with, making food, cooking food, delivering food, raising funds. But since the full-scale invasion of Russia in winter 2022, Ukrainians' response to Russian aggression suggests that the everyday war that I described in the book has intensified. So activities have expanded to include making Molotov cocktails at home, right? Blurring that distinction between who is a civilian and who is a combatant, weaving camouflage nets. The image is from the Lviv Public Library, where on your way home from work or school, you can stop into the library and help weave these camouflage nets that are then delivered in person directly to the various fronts, depending on where they're needed. I'm sure you've heard lots of examples in the news, right? Destroying road signs to disorient Russian forces. All of these are really great examples. So I think the question is how to theorize this, right? Like, how do we think about this theoretically? How do we think about this as academics? And to my way of thinking, I developed Everyday War as an intervention into the literature on everyday peace. So everyday peace emerged from the field of peace and conflict research, which is part of critical international relations. And this peace and conflict research is very important in the world today because it has helped to inform the multi-track diplomacy system, whereby a multitude of stakeholders' views are taken into account. The real innovation of everyday peace for international relations is to sort of say, okay, let's look not just at elites, but from the bottom up at the activities that a wider range of actors are engaging in. But the problem with everyday peace, first of all, is that in international relations, the emphasis has become on a question of like the extent to which these efforts can be scaled up into geopolitical peace. And I'm really much more interested in the immediate outcomes, right? The proximate outcomes for the people concerned, right? Like Alexandra. How does it affect her? What is the impact on her life or her father's survival? I think those impacts are absolutely crucial. And I think it's also important to think about this critically because, of course, peace is not a luxury that Ukrainians can afford right now, right? As they embark on this very existential fight for their survival as a country. Everyday war is very different than war itself because of its objective. So people like Alexandra were concerned to maintain and preserve their caring connections. It's a fundamentally defensive and protective impulse. So in my research, I found that everyday war produced everyday ethics. And what I mean by everyday ethics is these civilians' moral thinking about human vulnerability in a setting where humanitarian law isn't being observed and ethics essentially have to be improvised, right? And so a good example would be a woman that I met with each year asked me rhetorically, she was talking about the dilemmas and the conflicts that she faced in her life as a result of her desire to help with a war effort. And she asked me, well, should I cook for the internally displaced at the shelter or my family in my home? And all across Ukraine, civilians were making really consequential choices. And so I think that, in listening to these stories of hope, of survival in Ukraine, I began to discern a very distinct pattern in which people made their choices based on the care that they had for other people, right? So they made choices based on their desire to protect other people's well-being, and especially their emotional well-being. And this pattern supports what feminist ethicists of care have actually been writing about for a very long time. It's just that it's not the kind of ethics that gets the most emphasis in traditional philosophy, right? The justice ethics that are based on reason and supposedly universal principles. And I'm especially inspired here by the anthropologist Veena Das, who talks a lot about how not needing to transcend the everyday to arrive at ethics, right? It's embedded in everyday contexts. And I think, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur may have said it best when he said that ethics is about how one lives well with and for others, So it's a much more grounded approach to what it means to make moral decisions and act ethically. So all of that is very abstract. Yuri and Edouard provide a really good example of these ethics. Because they were, they fought in the East, they demobilized, they returned to their city, only to find that not only could they not get jobs, but they were surrounded by other veterans who were having a lot of difficulty adjusting to life outside of war. And so they opened this cafe, and as you can see, they decorated it with bazookas. There was a real Kalashnikov on the table that you could pick up and aim, had been disabled, a real bulletproof vest. To get to the napkins, you have to pick up a deactivated landmine. And they created this context because they had two sort of twin objectives. The first one was soothing ex-soldiers, right? They cared about those soldiers. They could give them jobs and a space where they could just talk about what they'd been through with people who understood them. But they also wanted to raise the alarm and create a conversation around the war in the western part of Ukraine at a time when people were sort of in the mood to go on with their regular lives, not be preoccupied with this war that was going on in the East. And so, this cafe really, really challenges theories of militarization, the societal militarization, which usually proposes that, when a society militarizes, it's insidious, it's unconscious, it creeps into society. These values are unconscious, and our society comes to imbue these values in a rather unhealthy way. And I think that the paraphernalia that Yuri and Edouard brought back from the war shows how consciously and creatively they basically curated this environment in which they hoped that really constructive dialogues would take place. So there were cases of bullet casings that you could pick up as a souvenir and take home. So I think that, in addition to extending the peace and conflict literature into everyday war, we can also extend the literature on militarization into these very conscious and creative efforts that civilians were making. Another example is the volunteer body collectors. They too exemplify these everyday ethics. In the beginning, they began collecting the remains of fallen soldiers because the Ukrainian military simply did not have the capacity at that time. So I spoke with one, his name was Taras. He actually came out of retirement to drive on mined roads and lead small groups of people into Russian-occupied territory to exhume remains of people that were partially decomposed with tools that he had brought from home. So they had really it was very a very low tech operation. So I got to know Taras quite well, and I wanted to know, why did he do that, right? Because he did this at a considerable risk to himself. And he told me that, it wasn't that he wasn't bringing back the remains of people he knew, or even people that he knew. It wasn't even like a second or third chain. He said he did it because it was the right thing to do, right? There was this moral and informal, improvised ethics in the situation of violations of humanitarian law, in which, right, it's an obligation to allow access to remains. And also, he was very concerned to provide the bereaved with peace of mind. He knew he couldn't bring peace itself, but he had the sense that the least he could do was return the remains so that the bereaved could grieve and have some sense of closure. These activities have continued. This is a 2023 picture from The Guardian. So these activities have continued not because the military does not have the capacity, but because the scale of the mass graves is so large. And in this particular case, they're exchanging the dead with Russia. Okay, so far we've seen how civilians matter for survival with the example of Alexandra and her father. We've seen how they matter for the dignity of the dead and the peace of mind and the bereaved with the example of Taras and the Black Tulip body collectors. We've seen how they matter for emotional well-being in the cafe. I think in this last section of my talk, I want to talk about the challenges and the difficulties of surfacing these stories. So we know from an abundant literature in psychology that overwhelming experiences associated with violence result in a difficulty in recalling events. So many people before me have attested that this, the violence propagated by war is difficult, if not impossible, to render into language. Right? It's difficult to speak. So how does a researcher operate in an environment like this when many people can't tell their story, or at least can't tell their story in the way that you might expect it to be told, which is to say chronologically, right, with a beginning, a middle, and an end? We're used to hearing stories about what happened that start at the beginning and end at the end. And so I had to find some new ways of listening. And I started to notice that people talked a lot about objects and a lot about their physical experiences. And so the object example I will illustrate with Leonid and his Cadillac Eldorado. I met Leonid at a workshop for internally displaced people. And he really wanted to talk to me when he found out that I was from the Detroit area. because the Detroit area is where his favorite car is made, the Cadillac Eldorado. And so after the workshop was over, we sat down at a picnic table with, my tape recorder between us. And pretty soon he pulls my notebook from my hands and starts drawing this Cadillac Eldorado. I didn't know what a Cadillac Eldorado was. Before my time, I didn't have an image of it. But what's interesting about Leonid's story is that, he told me that what he most missed about his life in Donetsk was his collection of Matchbox cars, right? He had them all lined up on a shelf in the little plastic boxes. And he mourned the loss of his car collection. And he confessed that he had told the observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe this story, that he was really despondent not to have his Matchbox cars with him. And the observer said, well, you should go buy some new Matchbox cars, right? But of course, that isn't what he was saying. If we bring a more anthropological, ethnographic lens to his story, we realize that he's talking about loss in a way that doesn't require him to really talk about emotions directly. And also it's very, the Matchbox cars were a way for him to escape a little bit mentally into a world in which the cars were clean and protected. All of the cars in his real life were destroyed, exploded, without tires, glass blown out, crumpled. And I know this because he then scrolled through, after he showed me the neat picture of the Matchbox cars on his shelf at home, he scrolled through the images in his phone, and it was quite horrific, right? So this was thinking about the Matchbox cars was a way to manage all of his experiences and all that he had been through. So I tried to develop as sort of broad a range of ways of listening to people as I could. I think another really good example of this strategy is Fiona's Kitchen near Kherson. So this was the kitchen where we did our interview. She had fled Luhansk when it became obvious that it was completely unreasonable and unsafe to stay. She had 5 girls, and she knew she had to get them out of there. And so we began talking, and she spoke for probably 45 minutes about the Euro remote repair, like the remodel that she had done before she left of her kitchen, and the beautiful gleaming appliances, which she had to sell to buy bus tickets one by one for the daughters. And at first I was perplexed. I had no interest in kitchen appliances. It was the make, it was the model, it was the year of the toaster and the dishwasher and the stove. And then I realized she was telling the story in her own way. And this too was partly a story about loss and partly a story about her own personal recalibration of values. Because over time, gradually, she realized that what was truly paramount for her was the survival of her 5 girls. And that was so much more important than the quality of the kitchen in which she was cooking, right? So it was both about loss and it was about survival. I met a couple of her daughters who were not in a frame of mind to tell their own story. And so this is it was a powerful way to access the family's experience without probing in a way that would have been inappropriate for that context, right, in which people are quite traumatized by their experience. Okay, so I want to leave you with a happier story, which is Pasha. I think that, ethics of care are really important because they have the ability to hold back the destruction of war for long enough for us to also recognize the reassertion of dignity and the care that people extend to each other. And Pasha is a really classic example of this because he fled Donbass when his home was destroyed in a mortar attack. And he went to the outskirts of Kiev. He had lost everything, but he and his wife began to rebuild this shack. This is a picture of, actually, this is the window of the shack, and that's his daughter's house next door. Started to rebuild with the materials that they could scrounge up. And Pasha observed that pretty soon the neighbors started to drop by and ask what they needed. And soon enough, spare doors, extra windows, canned tomatoes, all started to be dropped off, easing Pasha and his wife's transition into this life in displacement. And Pasha told me, that feeling that you could be left without anything? I said, of course. It's gone, right? So paradoxically, his dispossession relieved rather than exacerbating his sense of loss. He became completely convinced that no matter what happened, his society, people around him would step in through these ethics of care, and somehow he'd be okay. So I see that I'm out of time, and we definitely want to leave time for questions and answers. I have sort of a summary slide, right, that we can expand the study of peace and conflict. Militarization can take a lot better account of these conscious and strategic activities. And these 2 points really inform my main point, which is that everyday ethics elicit this ethical behavior, and this ethical behavior really helps us understand the reassertion of human dignity in such a difficult context. So the extreme harm and the profound care coexist in a very symbiotic relationship. One elicits the other. So I will stop there and open it up to questions. I don't know who's going to moderate.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Greta. This was a really exciting talk. And now we can have questions from the audience. We also have questions from people who are watching this online. So please, I know it might take a few minutes to kind of think, to absorb everything. There's so much, I think, to think about. Is there anything online?
Not quite yet.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I think it's really, well, first of all, thanks for the amazing talk. I look forward to reading the book. I think your strategy to have research sites across the country geographically was really interesting. I'd be interested to hear differences, similarities you noticed between your observations, in Lviv versus in the south, in Kherson versus in Severodonetsk, or where you were, if, how displaced peoples were finding themselves in those areas, but then also just these manifestations of everyday war, if they were different or were there some continuities across spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful question. And yes, there were differences. I think that people who have gravitated towards the potential for jobs as well as the possibility that they might become more politically engaged. And so they were interested in sort of this civic engagement that's very prevalent across Ukraine. And that drew people that were interested in that type of work, right? In that type of activity. Lviv drew people who were wanted to be in what they deemed Ukraine's cultural capital. And they were interested in working creatively both within Ukraine and with Western Europe. So sometimes it was the people who thought they might move onward to countries in Europe, other countries in Europe. With Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, those two cities drew people who either left family members behind and were going back and forth, very, very difficult situations, and also people who had an explicit plan to go back. So they were deeply affected by not really being in safety at all, but being very, very close to the front line, sometimes traversing it to go visit people or their homes. And then Kherson similarly attracted people who wanted to get far enough away to be safe, but were seriously considering returning to either Luhansk or Donetsk in the near future. And oftentimes, made an effort to travel back to visit, friends or family members.
Yes. If you maybe introduce yourself at the last place.
My name is Oksana Shapanik. I'm a scholar fellow advisor center in Varavia. I want to continue the previous question with the geographical representation of your case studies in the cities. For instance, Kharkiv accepted around 100,000 of inner displaced people in 2014. And also they were part of them were settled in the temporary settlement built with the help of with the support of international organizations, for instance, like the German organization GIZ. I wonder, within your choice, have you been looking on Kharkiv, or if not, why you haven't decided to start also to build study with interest-based people.
I went to Kharkiv. Yes, I went to Kharkiv. I went to Kharkiv, and yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a real hub for IDPs. I did do some interviews there, but it didn't become a repeat site because I didn't have the robust network that developed in Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Kherson, especially.
Yes.
Hello, I'm also a Wiser Center Fellow with Indonesia, and I'm also from Kharkiv. So basically, some of my fellows were also the refugees in the situation, and we're scholars as well. And I had such a question, like about the sociology of your research. You were talking about that a lot of the scenes with so many years they were becoming like the war situation is becoming normalized because people are living in this situation, they can't run away from it. And I was thinking about, were there the ways of how people were resisting the normalization of war in their everyday life, going away or hiding their personal life, or how they could survive psychologically in the situation, since you already were communicating with so many internally displaced persons? What I was going to ask you that in this context, right now we are experiencing already the new generation of children who are being born in the war situation. What it was already the voice already enduring for 9 years. So how people were kind of resisting this everyday war? Maybe you can also tell about this as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's that's a great question. There's a lot of effort to cushion the effect on children, which is very pronounced. Carrillo, was pointing out that children learn to learn, how to get to the air raid shelter before they learn how to get to school, and they learn the calibers of military weaponry before they learn how to read. And so I'm afraid that this has a profoundly traumatic effect on children. And there's a lot of effort that goes into different forms of working with them. But at a certain point, it's war, right? And people are damaged by war. So I don't want to paint a rosy picture for the future of these children. The modalities that I saw to, you spoke of normalization, but there's also this whole question of how to deal with trauma. And there was a lot of different, very creative and innovative ways to bring people out of that frame of mind. Sometimes it had to do with bringing people to nature. And that appeared to be especially effective with the children who, after all, need to play, be outside, be with people they can talk to. So play. There's a lot of art, painting, but also things that are more tactile. So there's a lot of sensory therapies that have to do with, perhaps you make something out of tinfoil, and anytime something is sensory, it helps to stop the process of dissociation that can happen when an individual is very traumatized. Other forms of sensory therapy had to do with 3 boxes with different textures on the floor. One is pebbles, one is big round rocks, one is sand. And you have a person who doesn't necessarily want to talk about their problems, right? What wouldn't be characteristic for them to, for example, see a psychotherapist or, do one-on-one therapy or something like that, right? But they found that somatic modalities were very effective in helping people to regain a sense of embodied self. But, the list goes on. There's so many projects, so many modalities. And I feel like, Ukrainians know best what works for them. I'm just mentioning the modalities that people told me were working for them. But there's much more, right?
We have a question here from somebody who is watching online. It's Emma Carlson, and she's writing, I am an undergraduate student at Montana State University. Were the individuals who you interviewed open to talking to you? How do you think that Americans who are in Ukraine or Eastern Europe conducting research are treated? And what language did you use when conducting interviews in Ukraine?
Okay, that's 3 questions. Were people open to speaking with me? Yes. However, there were 2 limiting factors. The first is that many people did not want to discuss politics, right? So they wanted to circumscribe the topic of the interview to matters of adjustment after displacement. So that was the first limitation to that. And then the second limitation to that was that, the ethics of doing research in a setting like this is that you need to be careful to make sure that somebody is actually ready to talk to you. And for that purpose, I used the assistance of some NGOs and grassroots organizations that knew who they thought would be ready and willing and desiring to speak to me. Other people, I would spend time with them in shelters, but it was more a matter of sharing a meal together, you know, walking around in the courtyard together, not, as I mentioned before, like a probing type of, you know, interview situation, right? Just sharing time and space with them. As for language, all of my respondents were given a choice of Russian, Ukrainian, or English. In the very beginning, the majority chose Russian because they had just fled predominantly Russian-speaking regions. Over the course of the research, that changed, and the balance shifted in the direction of English and Ukrainian. Were I to begin this research today, I would not speak Russian, right? There's a lot of resistance against Russian. It's associated with a lot of negative feelings. And so if I was an American starting my research in 2023 or 2024, you know, I would want to offer people the same choices, but I would anticipate that the vast majority of people would choose to speak in Ukrainian.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sam Farmer. I'm a doctoral student in the Slavic department, and I have two questions. So war is a gendered experience. Your experience is different depending on if you're a man or a woman, and it's often a very binary gendered experience. But I'm wondering, in your concept of everyday war and in your interviews, how gender basically functioned in the various responses of your respondents, and also what the gender breakdown was of like how many women were in your respondents as civilians versus men. And then my other question is essentially everyday war as a concept more focused on like war experiences of war as displacement, as opposed to, for example, war as a besieged city or an occupied city, which very much keeps civilians in place, if that makes sense. So what's the I'm interested in like how gender and displacement play into the research in the book, how they show up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. It's an important question. And I think that the war upended couples' traditional gender roles because, you know, when men went to fight, women had to pick up a lot more functions. That went both ways. One of the interesting things in my research was that the social service agencies thought that encouraging people to resume traditional gender roles would be a good path for adjusting to life in displacement. So in other words, they would say, all right, we're going to get all the women together and we're going to do makeovers and teach them to be feminine again after having learned to fix the tap, change the light bulbs, you know, pull in a really good living, take the kids to school, fix the car, everything, right? When their partners were missing. So that was their concept of a way to basically regender these relations, right? That was their thinking. In terms of the breakdown in my interview sample, I basically designed it as a quota sample to get approximately equal numbers of men and women. I also collected demographic information on, type of housing, marital status, right? Whether married, single, divorced, perceived economic well-being, and then age, right? So in each of those locations, so that I could get a relatively balanced sample. As for everyday war, I think everyday war is anything you do to preserve a lived world in a situation where there are violations of humanitarian law. So I think it happens both in war zones where people have to share generators, like the disabling the road signs example, right? There are incoming invading forces. If we dismantle the road signs, they'll be more confused, more likely to get lost, and less likely to succeed in their operation. That's one example. It also functions in displacement, though, because so many people are not, even though they might flee the actual zone where the war is happening, it's happening in so many parts of Ukraine, and typically they're traveling back to care for friends and other loved ones. I think that, a dimension of everyday war that I didn't really have a chance to go into today has to do with the ways in which relationships became sort of miniature sites for international relations when people found themselves on different political sides. And when that happened, marriages broke up, parents and children stopped speaking to each other, or they had to find ways to simply not talk about matters of the war, right? Which was also a loss for their relationship. So that's a manifestation of everyday war when it actually comes into one's home. And as one woman put it, people were like bombs, a simple phrase and they'd explode because they disagreed. We disagreed. So that's another manifestation. And I think that, in terms of the gender manifestation of it, many people told me that men tended to be more pragmatic in terms of avoiding difficult topics and getting on with friendships that had to take a very, very different form. So they took more in stride in those when a romantic partnership or a friendship basically became a crucible where much larger forces intersected of, language and these geopolitical tensions. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm Laura Therick, PhD student in the School of Information. I'm curious if you focus at all on people's consumption of technology or media, or how they were communicating at this time, how they considered media, what they thought was trustful, what was not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So the whole question of the media is a really interesting one because people, found themselves estranged from friends and family that they used to communicate with quite intensively on social media. And so that represented a real loss in their life. But probably the most dramatic manifestation was the feeling that consumers of Russian media had become zombified. So they were no longer even in their right mental faculties as a result of consuming Russian media. And this was very important for my research because, in a way, if you disagree with a person's politics, saying that they have simply been harmed by the media was easier than saying that they believed that and they're wrong, right? It was a way of sort of ascribing blame to Russian authorities instead of the individual, him or herself. And so that zombification inflected a lot of personal relationships, both within Ukraine and, of course, across the border.
More questions? Questions online?
Okay.
All right. So thank you. Thank you so much, Greta. That was really fascinating. I'm grateful to you. This is so wonderful event.